how to kind of show that disability is not itself necessarily a disadvantage. And
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Is not necessarily a disadvantage.
Disadvantage. Oh, yeah.
There are several ways of putting this, but
Yeah.
I wrote to you and said, I'm going to talk about, ask your permission, but the three of us.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is that the volume is called Gene Editing in the Age, or Human Flourishing in the Age of Gene Editing. So I am making the claim, if you will, that all three of us have a disability with some genetic cause. And this is based on kind of what we know about ourselves, but also about the fact that geneticists say, number one, everything is genetic. So many of our disabilities are reinterpreted. I've mentioned this as having a genetic origin. But the important thing, the significant thing, is not so much about the genetics of it, which is something to think about, because genetics link you much more closely to your ancestors and descendants in a way that is meaningful in terms of family narrative. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's important, but also gives you a sense of the idea of having a genetic narrative, gives you a much stronger identification with your disability as it's being an essential part of you, mm-hmm. rather than something that kind of happens to you later in life that is an add-on to an essential you.
An accident.
And I think all three of us feel that because we've always understood ourselves in one way or another from childhood, as being essentially this is who we are and it's part of us. I'm using us to talk about this, and I wonder whether talking about that in this context might be important. I don't know, but I'm going to write about this and claim us, because we go on together, a lot, and these complementary identifications and conflicting access requirements make us an interesting team.
Yeah, well, I think there's a space, right, to talk about, and I think you're right to talk about the advantages is a hard word, but it's better than affordances. God, I hate that word. The ways in which we might have felt advantages in certain of these places also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, as in getting free.
I have no problem, especially at this age, of talking and thinking and knowing all of the kind of advantages I have now with the lifelong genetic hearing loss.
Yeah. Right. I mean, my argument is everybody's going to be disabled eventually, so it's a great advantage to start early.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
Yeah. Well, it's the idea of disability expertise.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that we are lifelong disabled people.
Right.
And we have expertise in our particular conditions, which, I mean, on a practical level would be useful to the vast majority of people who become disabled later in life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all they need to do is call on us.
Right.
Yeah. That played out for me very pointedly in one date I had, who was actually Lithuanian, had come from that, but he had just in the last 10 years had a major sharp hearing loss.
Yeah.
And so the career that he had before had been dropped, and now he was selling cars at CarMax and struggling with that, lovely gentleman otherwise, but that's what, I mean, it's almost like, I hate to use it, but he latched onto me, and of course wanted to continue having dates, and even said, we have so much in common. I'm like, no, we don't really. For him, the very fact that I understood his hearing loss and did not stigmatize it, and he didn't have to feel ashamed about it, was all and everything.
Yeah.
You know, and he even asked me, he said, so when you picked the place where you sat in the restaurant, where we sat in the restaurant, why did you pick that place? You know, it's like he
Yeah.
knew he tapped into some
Yeah.
source
Yeah.
here that
Yeah.
would explain a number of mysteries to him.
Yeah.
What happened to him?
He wasn't divorced yet.
Oh my
Oh.
That
God.
came to be revealed on the third date.
What-
Oh,
On
man.
the third date?
Huh?
On the third date?
Yeah, on the third date mentioned. Well, he was in the process, right? Of a long
Well,
divorce.
we're
and
all
then,
in
and
the
then he
process.
said too, so,
Exactly.
well, I said, all the
Marriage is always
all
about
the power
being
to
in
you,
the
but
process.
no, I'm just not going there. You got real defensive. Well, like, when is good enough? It's been 6 months. The process is 6 months long already. Like, when do I get to start dating? I said, I don't have that answer for you. All I know is, like, that's not what I do.
I can't do
okay?
that, yeah.
No, and I also don't want to be the rebound
Yeah.
relationship.
No kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I said,
exactly.
so take a year or two, and then you
And then
have my
call me,
email address. In a year from now, see if I'm still around. Contact me.
Where is
But
this?
that was
Where is this guy? In
this was
Louisville?
actually in Connecticut. This
Oh,
was
it's
in
in
Connecticut.
Connecticut.
So yeah, I don't often even get to a third date. So anyway,
All right.
yeah, the knowledge, expertise, yeah. is a big
Well,
part of it.
the terms I use that come from the language of competency is competence and proficiency.
Yeah.
So the argument I make is about us is that we exceed competence. We have proficiency.
Yeah. And I mean,
Thank you.
deaf parents have been screeching, to use a lovely term, about this, for a long, long time. That
Now, what are they screeching?
Nobody ever asked the deaf adults
Oh,
what
how-
might be a good thing to do with deaf kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
I
keep
know.
asking all these other experts,
Yeah.
but no one ever asked them. So I think that that'd
Yeah.
be great.
Well,
why
somehow
don't
it's a
we-
mystery to anybody that people with disabilities would be parents, for heaven's sake.
I know.
Mhm.
Why don't we go back and record comments about pace
Yes.
and what was the next thing?
Discomfort,
Discomfort,
frustration.
yeah.
So we've
Why
come
don't
up
we
with
record
come up, but
yeah.
I definitely wanted to go back to Welling, for example,
Yeah.
on the discomfort list for me, but pace. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And then we could come back to your question.
So and maybe
So that
I'm
there's
sorry,
like
what was
some-
my
and-
question?
and
Whatever
maybe-
your question was. Don't
maybe
think
I'm
of
trying,
it.
so
A few
pace like
sentences
could
ago.
have came up with Rosemary talking about eating, but pace maybe that is related to our way of accessing the world and how that's also playing out when we access these
Right.
spaces.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
yeah. So let's record that.
Okay.
Or are we recording now?
We're recording now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We are?
Yeah.
We've
Oh,
been for the
she's
whole
sneaky.
time? Oh.
Oh, she's sneaky. Okay. Well, let's talk about pace.
Maybe more real you, but I thought what we were talking about was really important, so I
Oh,
turned it
you-
on.
yes,
And in
okay.
terms of this, it can be cut
Okay.
off. I can cut that off as a side. It was an 8-minute conversation there,
Okay.
but it's relevant. All right.
All right.
So now
Back to pace.
back to pace.
One of the things that I realized in all this work I've done in museums, actually, I have to say I've been struck in the last 2 days. I wrote this book about museums, and there was a point in my many visits to museums where
Yeah.
I said, if I never have to go to another art museum for the rest of my life,
Oh.
it'll be fine.
And here you are.
And here I am. But what I realized is because in my normal everyday life, although I have residual vision, I do not pay attention to it. It's just there, it does whatever
Yeah.
it does. It doesn't matter to me. It's not how I gain information. And so the only time that I consciously focus my attention on the visual array is when I'm in an art museum. And that requires the most extreme mental attention,
Focus, yeah.
focus. And it's fatiguing.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I find it hard to stand for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I always seek out someplace to sit. And I often feel some level of being overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
or even sometimes dizzy. I mean, it's a kind of physiological feeling. And so for me, just, and I register, anytime I go into any kind of exhibit space, I have some kind of advanced knowledge of, is this like the Metropolitan?
Yeah.
Is this going to be a lifelong endeavor for me to get through this thing? Or is it like, okay, a couple of hours will be done? And so I'm always have that in my, back pocket as to terms of how I need to pace the expenditure of attention.
So endurance might be
Endurance is a
a
part
term
of pace.
to use,
Yeah.
right?
And I think that's true of everybody. I mean, I think people,
Right.
though it doesn't seem like it should be, that going to a museum can be very tiring.
Right. You
To
could
anybody.
climb a mountain
Yeah,
for 4 hours and you'd be less exhausted than going through
yeah,
exhibits at a museum for 4 hours.
yeah. But there's a different level of, it's mental, but it becomes physical
Right.
And also-
stamina
and
that's
also-
required.
Oh,
and also
stamina.
because you
Yeah.
can't make as much selections about what to quote
What to
look
do,
at and
yeah.
what not to
Yeah.
do, right?
Right.
Where after a while I'll just decide to
Well,
abandon
actually-
all that for just the one picture that catches my eye.
As I
you know,
said
so-
at
Yeah.
one of these museums, one of my favorite people to go to museums with is Catherine Sherwood,
Oh,
because she's an artist herself.
Right.
But because she has mobility limitations.
So she gets
So-
weary.
Well, she gets weary in a different way, but she's usually in a wheelchair or a scooter.
Mhm.
But our routine is we will go into a gallery and she will basically look around from a central location.
Yeah.
So she'll look around
yeah.
and then she will spot the 2 or 3 items that are most worth
Yeah.
paying attention to.
Mhm.
And so then we will go and I will tune in and she will say what interests her and we'll have a conversation. And so then I know I'm missing everything else in the room,
Right.
but I don't care.
Yeah.
And so then we move on. And I'm also benefiting from her absolutely trustworthy
Right.
aesthetic
Yeah.
appreciation.
So
of
she
this work.
exercises the principle of selection,
Yeah.
which is important for people with disabilities
Yeah.
because of endurance and pace,
Yeah.
right?
But also
Well,
because
that's
she's...
about
yeah.
relationality again too, being able to trust, feeling that you can trust
Yes.
someone
Yeah.
else's.
Right.
I mean, I have
yeah.
trusted informants.
Uh-huh.
That's what I seek. But the thing with Catherine, because she's an artist and an art historian, she could go into any art space in the world and already know
Right.
something about everything. And so she can look around and sort of take a snapshot of everything in the room and assess it and then give me the edited version.
Yeah.
So she's an expert user of those spaces.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But she's also aware of
Peach?
physical. Oh, I'm being fed a peach.
I think fed a peach.
Physical stamina issues
Mhm.
because she has them herself.
Yeah. Huh.
But
Well,
what
some-
about you guys
some-
in
well,
pace?
Some of what you said, I've noticed that when I access these spaces with other people, that much like you with eating, I'm one of the first to finish a room. And I don't know. I've not ever thought about that other than it makes me feel like weird and self-conscious, like I didn't pay enough attention. Except it is the case that I kind of whole scale. I'm not an art historian. I know very little about art, but I whole scale a place, and I don't feel. I just give up feeling guilty about not the fact that I didn't look at every piece on the wall. I look for something that's interesting right when I enter a room and go towards it. Maybe also I visually process really, really
I think you
easy and
do.
fast, and so.
I mean, in some ways, if I thought of who is the ideal art viewing companion for me as a blind person,
Yeah.
and I mean, there are the people that I know, like Catherine Short, and then members of my family and other individuals that I know. But if it was a generic, I would say I would prefer to view art with a deaf person, most especially a deaf artist.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Because I, mainly from knowing you, but from knowing other deaf people, I understand that high level visual processing. So that your visual processing expertise is, I would say, on a higher level than your average sighted person.
Mm.
And so I would be more interested to hear what you had to say, because I know that you would notice things, details or something, or you would be able to articulate qualities that other people might not.
You know
Be
what might
sensitive.
also be an alliance too is the way that I read.
Yeah.
So like you know there's that stuff that they put on the wall always
Yeah.
by LA, which they over excessively did with the James Welling exhibit.
Right,
yeah.
There's also a little modern over the top written, and I guess in part because I can kind of photographically read it,
Yeah.
to pick out what's there. Whereas
And then you can
remember-
go in and say, oh, here's the key phrase.
This one line is
Yeah.
important, right?
Right.
You don't have to read it all the way,
Blah, blah, blah.
So yeah, I mean, for me, because there is so much text on the wall in museums,
Yeah.
I'd much rather have you doing the pre-editing for me
Yeah.
than to hear somebody read the whole
Yeah.
paragraph.
Yeah. Reading the whole 16 pages of the menu.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Instead of
It's just go to.
but I think we should talk about the menu because I think
Yes.
that's an interesting.
the food thing.
Because in our being together, one of us is always reading the menu, right? And
Yeah.
the
that menu-
level of detail.
It's both about food, but it's also about the art museum. Reading the menu of the
Right,
other museum.
exactly,
Yeah.
and the authority to edit
Yeah.
seems crucial.
Yeah.
I feel like in some cases where menu reading goes on, which it does when the three of us are together, I know I always read every word of the menu because the level of detail is,
It's
I
enchanting
think,
to you.
important
Yeah.
because we eat together. So
Yeah.
I'm imagining that the level of detail is important to Georgina because I know about the rituals of food and eating together.
Yeah.
But somebody was reading the menu the other day and doing it really like, okay, there's chicken, fish,
I did that. I did
And-
that.
She did that.
and meat or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there are different contexts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
But-
mean, there's a certain kind of a restaurant that you go in and you're having lunch, you want to be quick about it. So you say categories: salad, soup, sandwich,
Right.
whatever. And then for me, I can say, oh, I feel like a sandwich. So skip all the other stuff.
Exactly.
Just read me those items. And so that's a kind of helpful editing process. Whereas if we go to a
Yeah.
fine dining establishment where there's a pleasure in the descriptive language,
And all the adjectives.
yes.
Right.
I mean, for instance, I always like to hear the dessert menu,
Yeah.
even if I don't order from it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's erotic.
Yeah. And then I feel like I've had dessert
Yeah.
Right.
and maybe something else. But yeah. But the parallel in museums is we haven't on this trip been to such a museum, but if you go to the Louvre or you go to the Met or
Yeah.
any of these giant museums, that in effect there's a menu.
Yeah.
What are you going to visit?
Yeah.
Because
Right.
you can't do it all in one day.
Right.
So you have to make a selection. And often I mean, in the Louvre in Paris, they literally, you go down into the central area and they have different listings.
Concourses.
Yes, that you
Yeah.
go towards.
Right.
So you stand them on like location and say, this way,
Yeah.
ancient Greek sculpture. This way, high Renaissance painting. This way, so
Right.
you kind of commit to a period and a media. So there is a menu, and there is there's sort of other levels of detail, so that in the Renaissance painting they'll list all the artists.
Yeah. And then you can choose out artists.
Yeah,
too.
but
Right.
you're still going to have to go through everybody else before you
Yeah.
get to the one individual.
I don't remember where, but I do remember that I did that, and I think that was
No,
because there
it
were
wasn't
so
you.
many-
It was some
there was,
man.
So many. That's because there were so many
Right.
categories, and after I dined with you a fair amount.
Yes.
But right, fine dining plates is usually a very small menu. So
Yeah, I
then
know, they have
it
6
is a
items.
delight to read them, but absolutely, that's what happens. Part two. Yeah.
So selection is really an important principle.
Yeah.
Right? For us, so
Yeah.
pace is an important principle. Selection is an important principle.
The entry.
The
itself
entry.
is
Yeah.
an important principle.
Thresholds, maybe.
Right. Yeah,
But-
I think embodied the affect part,
Yeah.
like the embodied affect that happens in some.
Well,
of these
let's
places.
talk about that.
Let's talk about that. And let's talk about, you were raising the category of disappointment or frustration or...
Yeah, well,
Negative emotion.
Frustrations, irritations,
Yeah.
places where you
Yeah.
felt that. I mean, because I definitely felt that in the Welling exhibit, the James Welling one.
You mean that they were irritated by us?
No.
No, I felt irritated by the whole exhibit,
okay.
and and it's like that thing too. You commit, you walk in, and then you paid the price, so
Yeah,
you
you
feel
have to
like you
do
need
it.
to stay. But actually, that can become kind of important. Like let the irritation stay and like kind of get to why you're irritated.
Yeah.
Right.
So I was irritated because everything was really visual, but the photography visual is play and the way overdone. What do they call that? The writing beside
Wall text.
Wall text.
Wall text.
Yeah.
The overdone wall text, and there were a couple of places I remember I was kind of having fun with it because it was so. It was so
over the top.
full of itself
Yeah.
that, and then I guess I was just really irritated by his way of wanting to see what was the phrase? See what couldn't be seen, or
Yeah.
to prove that seen. Like,
Part
I
of
think
that
I'm
is the
not patient.
limitation of a single artist
Yeah.
exhibition,
yeah,
where the fine-grained experience of the artistic product and production is so focused on,
yeah,
where if you're in an exhibit where there are a bunch of different artists, even thematically or historically arranged, you don't have to focus so much on what they're doing. But there were really a lot of pictures that he made, many of which were kind of, in terms of interest, quite thin,
Yeah.
where he needed to say, I don't know, something like,
Yeah.
this picture came when I needed to clean my lens and
Uh-huh.
didn't get around to it, and oh my gosh, wasn't that an interesting thing?
yeah.
Well, I had
Which,
a
unless you love him, you really don't want to know.
I
But
had
that's
a-
also, this is like the triangle too, the rhetorical triangle of the artist himself, and then also
Right.
the curators, what they're deciding and who they imagine the audience is going to be
Yeah.
that's playing out in that. So I curated that James Castle exhibit, that was it, is that the people at the Urban Art Space wanted me to do significant wall text because supposed to be the exhibit was really honed on his deafness and the deaf school days and impact. So they wanted me to narrate that story, and I started to do that. And after about 3 or 4 images, I said, you know what? I'm not doing this. I said, let the people see what they want to see. I'm going to give 2 talks if they want to come. I'll be there at several things. It just felt, again, over-imposing.
When you said that, what did they say? Did they argue with you, or?
Yeah.
I mean, what was
Yeah.
their argument?
Well, that, the main curator, Valerie Williams, who was an art historian and artist herself, after I had said, well, she said, how will you help people understand what his deafness means?
Right.
And
Meaning hearing people understand.
yeah. And I remember I said something like, well, I hope they'll struggle a little bit and try to work at it.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's a
So
great
selection,
answer.
Yeah.
My experience
Part of
with
it is
the
struggle.
Welling, whatever the hell his name is,
James.
James Welling exhibit was because so much of it was kind of touching on the ideas that I put forward as the hypothetical blind man.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
about
I remember,
the
yeah.
photographer is capturing,
I remember
you
that.
know, visually what can't be seen, and
Yeah.
all this sort of, I mean, all these kind of metaphors about,
Mhm.
and it may be, no, I don't think it is, but it often crops up in description of photography in particular,
Yeah.
because there's such a one-to-one analogy between the camera and the eye, and so the figure of the hypothetical blind man is always there,
Yeah.
you know,
Haunting.
always haunting. And so everything that you read me with a mocking tone, I said, "Oh yeah, I know, I know." So there was a kind of a pleasure in that, and you know, I could get off because there was such a lot of visual, highly saturated color.
Yeah.
So there was something appealing in that,
Yeah.
but you know, it was a nice space where we were the only people there.
And
Yeah.
we didn't know. I mean, we chose
Yeah.
to go there because it was in the area and because the description in the book was
It
interesting.
sounded
stuff
good.
and stuff, but we had no idea it was there.
Yeah.
I don't think it was a waste of time.
No,
We didn't take
no.
that long. And I guess sometimes, like feel like I learn from the things that irritate me too,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
doesn't feel accessible. The best part was the wire hangers in the corner.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
That
I
was
thought, hey,
good.
I could do that with
Yeah.
all my wire hangers.
I mean, the most irritating of these spaces that we've been to was the architecture museum.
Yeah.
Because it was basically like I could have stayed home and had you read me the book. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, they could have just put all that stuff together,
And how
And it was
ironic.
hot in there.
and it was hot in there.
And it
But
was so ironic because it's architecture, and these people know about how to do things supposedly well with space
yeah,
and make people work in spaces. And it was ironically like the worst use
Yeah.
of space
Yeah.
and person interaction with
Yeah.
that space that
yeah,
could possibly have ever happened.
yeah.
Like,
I mean, one benefit is that, and I mentioned it when we were on the tram, we did go by on our D train some buildings that were marked as
Mhm.
Gemeinde Wien
Mhm.
with, 1956 to 1959. So we could get an example of that. But
Yeah.
they were very undistinguished buildings.
Yeah,
Except for that big one, which may have been one, but
Yeah.
it wasn't clear.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I learned
I mean,
something
it had an
from
educational value.
There you go.
And
Okay.
I sort of appreciated this is often the case in historical museums, is that your movement through the space is supposed to simulate a chronology,
Mm-hmm.
so that each of the different stations that were marked by different colors were different historical periods.
Right.
Oh,
So although we came in at it at the wrong, as we always do, the wrong place,
out of
but if
space
we
and
had
out of
been
time.
in the right sequence, we could have done a historical tour
Right.
around that space and gotten a chronology. But even at that, before we went there, we were talking about how we all wished we knew something more about the specific of Viennese
Right.
architecture, because when we've been walking around or riding around on the tram, you have both been commenting on
Mm-hmm.
the architecture that we've been passing and wondering, oh, why is it like this, and why is it different in
Right.
in Vienna than in Paris or Berlin, or other European cities that